I'll ask that you now give your attention to our brother Mike and his exhortation titled, Whom You Serve Continually.
Okay, well, good morning one more time to all of you. It's been a real delight to be with all of you. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for your hospitality. It's been wonderful. So for our exhortation, we're going to consider the classic story of Daniel and the lion's den. A meaningful story for us at any age. It's one of the first lessons we teach to our children in Sunday school, the lessons of Daniel's faithfulness, his courage, and his bravery. His lesson for us as adults on nonconformity, his dedication to his God, his uncompromising spirit and commitment to his beliefs, and of course, God's ability to save. When we look at the story of Daniel and the lion's den, it also, is it not, a little prophecy of Christ's crucifixion and his victory over sin, that a righteous man, accused by his enemies, accused by a law that could not be changed or undone, was condemned to death, could not be spared by the king, but was, after having been put in the pit, literal or symbolic, was later brought out and rescued from that same pit or den, thereby breaking the power of the law to condemn the righteous man, and therefore bringing defeat to his enemies. The literal story of Daniel is also the symbolic story of our Lord Jesus Christ's victory over sin. But I think of all of those classic and powerful and meaningful lessons in the story of Daniel, I went for about 35 years of my life missing out on one more that was shown to me a few years ago. I'd like for us in our exhortation to consider one more lesson from the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which I think opens up a new lesson in his life, and I think it'd be a very good cap or a way to sort of roll all of our discussions this weekend into one takeaway lesson for all of us. And this lesson was shown to me in another Bible chiasm, once more in the structure or the pattern of the story here in Daniel chapter 6. So a little bit of exposition to open our exhortation. I like to sort of walk everyone through what I believe is the chiasm or the pattern in this chapter. And hopefully you'll see that perhaps there's more to the story of Daniel in the lion's den besides just Daniel being saved from the lion's den. So Daniel chapter 6, if you can follow along, I probably should have broken the rule of no visual aids in an exhortation, but we're going to try to narrate our way through this one. It's a pretty clear one, actually. So Daniel chapter 6. And so once again, as you recall, we start with sort of the beginning and end. We start from the outside, and we're going to work towards the middle. So the first section and the last section, we have verses 1 through 3, are where Daniel is preferred, or Daniel is exalted. So verse 3, for example, says, "Then this Daniel distinguished himself," and this matches or corresponds to the last verse of the chapter where it says, "So this Daniel prospered." So we've got the Daniel preferred and the Daniel prospered as the outer layers of the chiasm. Working our way closer to the middle, we then have a big section here of verses 4 through 9, where Darius signs and sends forth a decree that elevates himself over any other god or man. And then we have the section of verses 25 through 27 in correspondence, where Darius makes a decree to elevate not himself, but the God of Daniel. Verse 25, "Then King Darius wrote to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on all the earth, peace be multiplied to you." And it's a wonderful letter glorifying the one true God, as compared to glorifying himself in verses 4 through 9. All right, moving further in, we have in the verses 10 through 13, the next section of where Daniel is caught. Daniel is caught in sort of violating the law that the king had just signed, and his enemies condemn him to the lions. But in verses 23 and 24, after Daniel was saved from the lion's den, Daniel is restored, and his enemies are then condemned to the lions. So the enemies that condemned him in verses 10 through 13 are now themselves condemned in verses 23 through 24. All right, moving a bit further in, verse 14, the king, Darius, is displeased. He is upset at what's happening to Daniel. But after Daniel is saved in verse 23, the king is exceedingly glad. I'll read verse 23. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So we have a 180-degree shift in the king's emotions in this layer, verses 14 and verse 23. Getting closer to the middle now, we have in verses 14 and 15, like the second half of verse 14 into verse 15, is where Darius realizes that he is unable to save Daniel. And all of his labor and striving to rescue Daniel is in vain. He cannot save Daniel from his own love. But in verses 18 through 22, King Darius acquiesces in his efforts to try to save Daniel of himself, and then realizes that it is God who can save, that it is God who is able and does save Daniel. An interesting sort of cross-reference to take a break from the chiasm is Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, which I'll pull up and read for all of you briefly. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God." And so did Darius not learn this little lesson for all of us who seek to be saved by grace, that we know we can't save ourselves. It isn't our efforts that save us, but God's gift by grace. And I think Darius learned a little lesson on grace here in the chapter. All right, so we're getting really close, back in Daniel 6, we're so close to the center of the chiasm now. So in Daniel chapter 6, we just have a little bit of logistics now. So the first half of verse 16, the king gives the command to, well, he has no choice but to put Daniel in the lion's den. It can't be avoided at this point in time. And then we have in verse 17 and into verse 18, where the king has to they actually put the stone in front of the den of the lion. So it's a little bit of just the logistics of, the king says, take Daniel into the lion's den, and they put the stone over the den, and Daniel's covered up. So then what's left? What's right in the middle? What does the pattern in this chapter point us towards as perhaps the central drama and the centerpiece of this story? It's the second half of verse 16, where I'll read verse 16. It says, "So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, 'Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you.'" It's a confession of faith from a Gentile king. Perhaps the most powerful man in the world at this time declares a statement of faith right in front of Daniel, that he believes that Daniel's God is able to save him. The structural center isn't interesting. That, like the apex, the pinnacle of the story of Daniel in the lion's den, is not really on Daniel, but it's on King Darius. And the chiasm or chiasm is pointing us to this statement of faith as being the center of the story and what it all revolves around. So think about that for a minute, and I'll come to an interesting little side tangent here. If you come to the book of Hebrews, the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, my Bible spine is falling apart, so I'll try to pull it. Okay, Hebrews chapter 11. And there's an anonymous entry at the end of the chapter where there's a whole list of faithful things that are spoken of without names. And if you come to verse 33, again, in the listing of all of the wonderful acts of faith, verse 33 says, "Who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions." Hebrews chapter 11 says, by faith, the mouths of lions were stopped. And I think it's a fair assumption to say that this mention in Hebrews 11 is referring back to Daniel chapter 6. I think that's a fair connection. So it raises the question, whose faith? Whose faith was it that stopped the mouths of lions? Because if you think back to Daniel chapter 6, if you come back to after Daniel was saved, by no means am I trying to take away any faithfulness credit from Daniel, an incredible man whose faithfulness was displayed in his commitment to his prayer habits and his nonconformity to Darius's law. But after Daniel in verse 22 comes out of the lion's den, he says this, "My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths so that they have not hurt me because I was found innocent before him." So Daniel says that he was saved because God found him innocent. And I think that's certainly true. And I don't think that contradicts with this idea from Hebrews 11. I think it matches this symbology to Christ, that just as the grave could not hold our Lord because he was sinless, Daniel says, I was innocent before you, therefore God has saved me. So I think Daniel is spot on with matching it to the prophecy of Jesus in the future in this story. But what Daniel says was spoken after he was saved. That really isn't faith if it's already happened. I'm in no way trying to badmouth Daniel at all, but I think the person who truly expressed their faith and gave a confession of faith in this chapter was not Daniel, but Darius. And so feel free to agree with that idea, don't need to be dogmatic about it, but I think we can all agree, perhaps on this, that Darius's faith, given its position structurally in the story, perhaps given this theory of connecting to Hebrews chapter 11, it suggests that we maybe should rethink how we view Daniel chapter 6. I think the central drama of the story is not, can God save Daniel, but rather, can God with Daniel save Darius? Daniel, as you'll recall, was a really old man. It's estimated he was probably in his 90s when this chapter occurs. He's near the end of his life. At the end of the book of Daniel, you'll recall in chapter 12, verse 13, God gives him an assurance that he will go and he will be in his kingdom, that there is more to him beyond just this life. I think Daniel was already an incredibly faithful prophet, and he knew the end that was promised to him. My own opinion is that I don't think Daniel chapter 6 was there as a test of Daniel's faith. I think it was there as a strengthening of Darius's faith. And I think Daniel knew that from the very beginning of this little trial in his life in Daniel 6, that what was about to happen to him wasn't a test for him. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone at this point in time. I think he knew that what he was about to go through wasn't for him, but was for his friend, was for Darius. So put yourselves in the shoes of Daniel if you could. Just try to picture yourself, if you were Daniel, at this moment in the center of the chapter, when you know you're about to be thrown in the lion's den. And you might think, whether God saves me or not, that's God's prerogative. I trust him by faith no matter what. And as you're about to go through this trial, the person that you care about, the person you've been working with, the person you've been teaching, this person close to you, looks you in the eyes and says, I believe that your God can save you. They confess a statement of faith right in front of you. This person who you've been teaching for so long, you've been trying to build their faith, trying to show them God's ways. You've been trying to be a good example for them. You've put years and years of work and patient teaching in with them, and maybe they're getting close, but they're not there yet. A person who you do care about, you have a relationship with, and you want them to be a part of God's family, and a trial emerges in your life, and in the middle of that trial, your friend turns to you and says, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Imagine that beautiful and wonderful moment for Daniel, knowing that it wasn't really about him. It wasn't about his own deliverance, temporarily, already a 90-year-old guy from the den of lions. It was about how he could help God save his loved one, save his friend. And so for us, I think this is the new lesson, this additional lesson of Daniel. Again, my theory is I think Daniel could see, well before we could see, that what he was about to go through wasn't about his own salvation, but it was about saving someone he cared about. And so for us in our lives, the lesson is that if we have people that we care about, people that we would love to bring into God's family, people in our natural families, nieces, nephews, children, grandchildren, friends at work, colleagues, some of our students, preaching contacts, whoever it might be that we're trying to teach, that we're putting years and years of work into, that matters to us. And there's good days and bad days, there's progress, there's frustration. Well, we have to be like Daniel to their Darius. And so all of these lessons of Daniel, his patience, his steadfastness, his faithfulness to his God, his selflessness, his righteousness, all of these classic lessons of Daniel, they should mean even more to us if we're trying to save other people in our lives, if we're trying to help them also become people of faith. Like what a wonderful thing that when Darius made his confession, he said two things. He noted two very distinct statements. Number one, that God is able to save. But number two, that Daniel served his God continually. And so as impressed as Darius's faith was with God's ability to save, that was sort of half of the reason why he gave this statement of faith. And the other half is that Daniel showed him what it means to be a servant of God by how Daniel served him continually. And so this is the model for all of us. And I think this is a great way to recap or sort of work all of our lessons of this weekend into one takeaway lesson. And that is, what is the example that we are all setting at any age? How can we ask our young people not to be ruled by their smartphones if we as adults aren't willing to do the same? And how can we urge our children to not get addicted to social media, to not jump on TikTok or Instagram and get lost in that world if we as adults are constantly on Facebook ourselves? And how will the next generation learn God's ways if we're not communicating it to them in regular face-to-face conversation and carving out the time for us to use our words and our actions every day to impact the next generation? How will they learn the truth if we're not eagerly teaching it, as certainly Daniel did with Darius for how many years before this story? If we're not spreading it and teaching it and putting our beliefs out into the world to be learned, how can we expect the next generation to follow after us? How will they join God's family and be a part of our community of faith and be sons and daughters of God themselves if we're not supporting our own community and making it a priority and making this a positive, beneficial resource to them? And how will they learn faithfulness if they can't see it lived in example by their elders? And if they can't look at our elders and those above them in the ecclesia and see a model to follow after, how will they learn faithfulness themselves, as Darius learned it from Daniel? So if Daniel chapter 6 isn't primarily about God saving Daniel, although God certainly did save Daniel, but rather is about God with Daniel saving Darius, then as we now share the bread and wine and consider our Lord's example, maybe our motto or our point of consideration would be not, how can I do better so that I can be saved, but rather, how can God with me save others? Save my family, save my friend at work, save somebody that I really care about and would love to bring into God's family. Let's think how we can be like Daniel to those Dariuses in our lives. And of course, we have the example of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is sort of the fulfillment of all of this, who laid down his life for each one of us. Let us take up the example that he set and that Daniel set, and follow after them in striving to help and support each other and the next generation as we all strive together to enter God's kingdom. I'll conclude with this verse, John chapter 13, verse 15, where Jesus says, "I have given you an example that this you should do as I have done to you." Thank you.